Rome, 235 AD. In the marble halls of imperial power, an emperor prepares to commit the most scandalous act ever recorded in ancient history. It is not a bloody battle nor a political conspiracy. It is something that will shake the very foundations of Rome at its core. Maximinus Thrax will force his own son to dress as a woman, and will publicly marry him, before the astonished eyes of the Senate and the Roman people. What you are about to hear is not fiction nor exaggeration, but a documented historical episode that reveals how far the madness of absolute power can go. It is the story of a barbarian emperor, feared for his brutal strength, and of a son whose beauty became his condemnation. A story that shows how obsession, paranoia, and moral corruption can drag an entire empire into the abyss. If you think you already know Rome's excesses, wait. Because what Maximinus did defies not only laws but the deepest limits of civilization itself. Stay, because this true story will unsettle you from the very first second to the last. The Roman Empire of the 3rd century stood on the brink of collapse. It was a world in flames, endless civil wars, barbarian invasions pushing deeper into the borders, runaway inflation that made coins worth less than the metal they were struck from, and emperors who lasted only months in power before being murdered by their own soldiers or political rivals. This period, known as the crisis of the 3rd century, was one of the darkest in Roman history. Rome, once the symbol of order and stability, had become an empire devoured by uncertainty. The Senate's authority had evaporated, the army dictated who ruled and who died, and the population lived trapped between violence and hunger. Amid this chaos emerged a figure who embodied the deepest fears of the Roman elite, Gaius Julius Verus Maximinus, a giant from Thrace. He had no noble lineage, no classical education, no respect for Roman traditions. He was the son of a Gothic herdsman and an Allan mother. But what he lacked in refinement he made up for with something Rome could not ignore: brute strength and a ruthless instinct for war. While the Roman aristocracy clung to tradition, the legions saw in Maximinus a man made for the dark times they were living through. And in that broken Rome, an implacable barbarian was about to become emperor. Maximinus was no typical Roman emperor. He was not descended from an aristocratic family, had not studied rhetoric, nor received the polished education of princes. His cradle was the wild frontier of the empire, and his teacher was war. Standing over 2 meters tall, a mountain of muscle and brutality, he was feared in every military camp since his youth. His reputation began to rise under the reign of Septimius Severus. In the campaigns against the Germans and the Britons, Maximinus earned the respect, and the fear, of his comrades. It was said he could fight for hours without rest, endure wounds that would have killed any other man, and that his ferocity was such that even barbarian enemies mentioned him in their war songs as Rome's demon. But his decisive moment came years later, in 235, during the campaign along the Rhine. The emperor at the time was Alexander Severus, a weak young man dominated by his mother Julia Mamaea. His attempts to negotiate with the Germans rather than face them in battle enraged the legions. To hardened soldiers, such behavior was not diplomacy, it was cowardice. In that climate of frustration, Maximinus seized his chance. With the strength of a bull and the cunning of a predator, he won over the troops, stirred their discontent, and ultimately led a revolt. The result was brutal: Alexander Severus and his mother were murdered in their own camp. For the first time in history, an uncultured barbarian, with no Roman blood in his veins, was proclaimed emperor by the legions. The Senate received the news in horror. A man who despised traditions, who knew nothing of law or philosophy, now occupied the most powerful throne in the world. But no one could stop him. The empire was in the hands of Maximinus Thrax, an emperor born not of noble lineage, but of violence. What no one imagined was that the most terrifying aspect of Maximinus would not be his brutality in war, but the sick and disturbing relationship he would develop with his own son. From the very day he was proclaimed emperor, Maximinus made it clear that his son Maximus would be the center of his world. At only 18 years old, the young man was named Caesar and heir to the throne. But it soon became evident that this appointment was not merely political, it was the reflection of a fixation that went far beyond paternal love. Maximus was everything his father was not, handsome, delicate, with features that fit perfectly into the Roman aesthetic ideal. His fair skin, wavy blonde hair, and slender build made him stand out in a court accustomed to military roughness. For anyone else, this would have been a source of pride. For Maximinus, it became a dangerous obsession. At first came the gestures of excessive control. He forbade young men from approaching him, dismissed all his male tutors and replaced them with women. The guards chosen to protect him were selected for their old age or lack of attractiveness, as if the entire Roman world was a threat to Maximinus' possessive eyes. Then the obsession moved into appearance. The emperor, who had never shown interest in fashion, began personally supervising his son's clothing and adornments. He did not choose armor or virile tunics, but brightly colored silks, elaborate jewelry, and increasingly feminine hairstyles. Maximus began appearing in public dressed in outfits that resembled those of a noble lady rather than an imperial heir. The senators and courtiers grew uneasy, but no one dared oppose Maximinus. The young man's public appearances became ever more disturbing, seated too close to his father, touched and caressed as though he were an ornamental object. Trapped in this golden cage, Maximus began to show signs of dissociation, a vacant stare, an empty gesture, as if he had learned to mentally detach from his own body just to endure the humiliation. The court murmured in silence. What had seemed like paternal protection was turning into a pathological obsession. And soon, that obsession would take such an extreme step that it would shake all of Rome. The year 237 marked the climax of imperial madness. While the empire bled from rebellions and wars, Maximinus made a decision no one could have anticipated. Before the Roman Senate, dressed in his imperial regalia, he announced that he would marry. For a moment, the senators breathed in relief. They thought that at last, the barbarian would choose a suitable wife who would ensure the continuity of the dynasty. But then he revealed the identity of his bride. She was not a foreign princess, nor a Roman noblewoman. It was his own son, Maximus, now fully feminized and presented as the beautiful Maxima. The silence was absolute. The marble walls of the Senate seemed to echo his words back as a reminder of the blasphemy they had just witnessed. Maximus appeared covered with a white veil, wearing a bridal stola adorned with pearls and gold. His gaze was lost, and though tears ran down his cheeks, he did not dare resist. Senator Cornelius Bulbus, an old man of more than 70 years, was the only one who dared to raise his voice. "Caesar," he cried, "what you propose is incest, sacrilege, and treason against the laws of the gods." His courage lasted seconds. Maximinus crossed the hall with the speed of a predator and, before the horrified eyes of all, strangled the senator with his own hands. The lifeless body fell at his feet. "Does anyone else object?" asked the emperor, his hands still stained with blood. No one answered. The wedding was celebrated the next day in the Temple of Venus in Rome, a sacred place for the Romans. But instead of jubilation, the entire city kept silent. The streets were empty, the houses closed. The people preferred to lock themselves away rather than witness what they considered an absolute profanation. The pontiff, forced under threat of death, carried out a hollow ritual, his words sounding like a mockery of imperial marriage. That day, Rome understood that Maximinus was not only a tyrant, but a man capable of dragging the entire empire into his personal obsession. And the reaction that was coming would be merciless. The news of the sacrilegious marriage spread through the Roman Empire like a fire impossible to stop. What had begun as a private act of madness became a crisis that threatened the very foundations of civilization. In Rome, the Senate boiled in silence. Men who had been political enemies for decades found common ground, absolute revulsion toward the emperor. In secret sessions, they began to discuss the unthinkable, deposing Maximinus, even if it meant defying the army. The women of the elite, guardians of family traditions, also reacted. The Roman matrons organized a silent boycott. They refused to attend banquets, ceremonies, and imperial functions. With their absence, they turned the emperor's celebrations into hollow, soulless spectacles. The common people reacted with fear and contempt. In markets and public baths, Maximinus's name was no longer spoken aloud, but whispered with indignation. Mothers warned their children using him as an example of the price of moral corruption. The priests were even more forceful. The College of Pontiffs declared that the marriage had broken the Pax Deorum, the peace with the gods. The auspices, the divine signs read in sacrifices, began to show ominous omens. Rome had been spiritually contaminated. The army, however, was the hardest blow for Maximinus. Soldiers, men raised in the idea of masculine honor, could not accept a commander who turned his own son into a wife. The centurions, backbone of the legions, began to murmur openly that the emperor had lost his virtus. Some deserted, others refused to look at Maximus during military ceremonies. The image of the heir dressed as a woman, sitting beside the emperor in war councils, was intolerable to those who had sworn to defend Rome with their blood. In the provinces, governors seized the moment. In Hispania, Marcus Claudius Pupienus declared he would not recognize the authority of an emperor who had violated the laws of gods and men. In Gaul, legions began to discuss the need for a new leader. And in the East, where family and tradition were sacred, the revulsion was total. Maximinus's sacrilege had united Rome as rarely in its history. Senators, soldiers, plebeians, priests, and governors agreed on one thing: an emperor who defied natural and divine law could not continue to rule. The entire empire prepared to rebel. The final spark ignited in the spring of 238 AD. Barely 2 months after the sacrilegious marriage, the legions that had once acclaimed Maximinus began to show signs of rupture. The trigger was a war council in the imperial camp, near Aquileia. Maximinus had summoned his generals to plan the response to the growing rebellions. But, as open provocation, he insisted that his imperial wife, his son Maximus, dressed in veil and stola, preside over the meeting at his side. The silence in the tent was unbearable. Then, one man decided to speak. Marcus Pupienus Maximus, a veteran general with more than 40 years of service, stood up and declared, "I do not recognize any woman in this war council. And I do not recognize as emperor a man who has lost all masculine honor." The words fell like thunder. Maximinus, furious, ordered his immediate execution. But this time, something changed. The soldiers assigned to carry out the order refused. Not a single finger moved. The air grew heavy with tension, until the centurions, with firm voices, declared the unthinkable: they would no longer obey Maximinus. The camp erupted into mutiny. The standards, symbols of imperial loyalty, were torn down. The legions declared that they would not follow a corrupt emperor and proclaimed Pupienus and Balbinus as the new leaders. For the first time in Roman history, an emperor was not overthrown by the ambition of another general, but by the moral rejection of his own troops. In Rome, the news ignited a fire. The Senate, emboldened by the military revolt, officially declared Maximinus a public enemy. The provinces joined en masse, provincial governors broke their loyalty, and cities began preparing to resist any attack from the tyrant. Cornered, Maximinus made a decision as desperate as it was foolish: if Rome did not want him as emperor, then Rome would burn under his fury. Condemned by the Senate, abandoned by much of the provinces, and questioned by his own legions, Maximinus made the choice that would seal his fate. He swore that if Rome rejected him as emperor, it would be destroyed by his hand. He ordered the troops still loyal to him to march on the capital and prepare to sack it without mercy. But even in that final act of defiance, the emperor's power was crumbling. As he advanced toward Italy, desertion multiplied. Men who had once feared him began abandoning him in the darkness of night. Others refused to march, murmuring that they no longer followed a man, but a monster who had offended both gods and men. The climax came on the outskirts of Aquileia on May 10, 238 AD. During the night, a group of praetorians led by the centurion Gaius Arius stormed the imperial tent. The scene they found seemed like a grotesque parody of marital intimacy. Maximinus was sleeping beside Maximus, both dressed in wedding tunics. The execution was swift and symbolic. The soldiers beheaded the emperor with the same sword he had used so many times to destroy his enemies. His head was sent to Rome as proof of his death and displayed in the Forum before being thrown into the Tiber, as if the city itself wanted to cleanse itself of his memory. Maximus's fate, however, was even more tragic. Freed from the physical chains of his father, he discovered that the psychological chains were impossible to break. His identity had been destroyed so deeply that he could no longer recognize himself as a man or an heir. Chroniclers recount that he spent his last days in a state of total confusion, and eventually threw himself out of a palace window, naked, in a desperate attempt to reclaim the only thing left to him, his lost dignity. Thus ended the story of Maximinus the Thracian and his son Maximus. Not with glory, but with shame. Not with imperial greatness, but with the tragedy of power without limits, which destroyed both the tyrant and his own blood. The fall of Maximinus the Thracian and the tragedy of his son Maximus are more than a disturbing episode in the annals of Rome. They are an eternal reminder of what happens when power knows no bounds. An empire that had tolerated cruel, violent, and even eccentric emperors could not accept the ultimate transgression, the destruction of the most sacred bonds, family and human dignity. Maximinus believed brute force would make him invincible. But he forgot that neither swords nor legions can sustain a leader who betrays the fundamental values of his people. And his son, a victim trapped in that madness, reminds us that some wounds, the wounds of identity, dignity, and spirit, are so deep that no victory, rescue, or ending can erase them. At its core, this story is a warning that transcends the centuries. Absolute power not only corrupts, it also destroys. It can turn a soldier into a tyrant, a father into an executioner, and an heir into a shadow of himself. What do you think? Do you believe Rome reacted too late to Maximinus's excesses, or was it inevitable that someone so brutal would end this way? Leave your thoughts in the comments and share this video so more people can reflect on the limits of power and the fragility of the human condition. And remember, history does not just speak to the past. It also warns us about our present.